The manicured lawns of the Sterling estate were a sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos, but all eyes were fixed on the silver Ferrari 250 GTO resting on the central dais like a god. Marcus Sterling, the billionaire tech CEO, stood beside the machine, his voice booming with the practiced confidence of a man who believed his checkbook could purchase history itself. He was in the middle of describing the car's legendary racing pedigree at Le Mans when a shadow fell across the silver paint. Leo Thorne, still dressed in his faded navy work coveralls, stepped through the invitation-only crowd of socialites, his boots leaving faint traces of red clay on the white marble. Without saying a word, Leo reached out, his calloused thumb hovering over a specific rivet near the base of the A-pillar. Marcus let out a shrill, panicked scream that silenced the quartet, barking for the local grease monkey to get his hands off the $48 million masterpiece because his sweat was more toxic than battery acid. Leo didn't flinch. He simply smiled with a quiet, devastating calm that made Marcus's face turn a mottled purple.
He pulled his hand back slowly and told the billionaire that it wasn't the sweat he should be worried about today, but the specific molecular density of the aluminum bodywork beneath the silver finish. Leo had seen a secret hiding in the metal that would turn Marcus Sterling's crowning achievement into a legal nightmare by sunset on this day. The air was stagnant and heavy over Thorne's auto, a place where the scent of old oil and sun-scorched earth defined the rhythm of the day. Leo was elbow-deep in the guts of a local farmer's tractor when a massive, gleaming transport truck shuddered to a halt at the edge of his gravel driveway. The air brakes hissed like a dying beast, and seconds later, Marcus Sterling stepped out of the climate-controlled cabin, looking as though he had been dropped in from another planet. Dressed in a bespoke linen suit that cost more than Leo's entire garage, Marcus didn't ask for help. He demanded it. He snapped his fingers, commanding Leo to bring him bottled water and find a way to fix the truck's cooling system immediately. Between demands, Marcus paced the dusty lot, his eyes scanning the various projects Leo had scattered around the yard with a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt.
He pointed a manicured finger at a rusted 1970s chassis on blocks, calling the yard a graveyard for metal husks and a refuge for men with no vision. Marcus bragged about the cargo inside the trailer and told Leo that a common laborer who spent his life covered in grease could never begin to comprehend the mechanical poetry or the historical weight of such a machine. He laughed, suggesting that Leo's limited mind was better suited for the crude mechanics of a lawnmower than the soul of an Italian masterpiece. Leo wiped a streak of black oil from his brow, his expression remaining as flat and unreadable as the desert horizon. He listened to the billionaire's insults with a quiet, observant dignity that Marcus mistook for simple-mindedness. Marcus thought he was speaking to a local nobody who was lucky to even stand in the shadow of his trailer. He had no idea that Leo Thorne was the legendary expert who had written the very Ferrari authentication manual Marcus kept in his glove box. The irony was a silent, ticking clock that would soon shatter the billionaire's world once the sun began to set over this dusty yard. Leo pushed through the screen door, leaving the billionaire's shouts behind, and entered the quiet, cedar-scented cool of the house. Sophie was sitting on the rug, her small face scrunched in concentration as she pushed a bright red plastic car across the floor. As the toy moved, it produced a faint, rhythmic rattle, a sound that most fathers would have ignored, but one that made Leo's pulse quicken with a phantom memory of his former life.
For years, Leo had lived at the high-velocity center of the automotive world, moving through the polished halls of Maranello and the frantic, high-stakes auction houses of Milan and London as the ultimate arbiter of truth. His wife, Elena, had been the guardian of that world's history, an archivist who could trace the lineage of a single piston through 50 years of racing logs. But 5 years ago, the loud world had shattered when the plane carrying Elena to a private collection in Geneva disappeared into the jagged peaks of the Alps. In the wreckage of his grief, Leo had made a vow to their daughter.
He promised Sophie that they would leave the cameras, the ego, and the hollow prestige behind for a life that was soft, slow, and honest. He traded the white glove inspections for the honest grease of a small-town garage, ensuring that Sophie's world would be built on the steady foundation of a father who was always present, rather than a legend who was always traveling. He watched her now, her laughter echoing against the wood-paneled walls, and felt a deep, protective need to keep the billionaire's noise from polluting their peace. Yet, as Sophie rolled the red car again, the specific frequency of that plastic rattle triggered his professional intuition. It was a hollow, discordant vibration that lacked the solid, dense resonance of true craftsmanship. He realized with a start that in Sophie's toy car was a rattle that sounded exactly like the vibrating frame of a forged chassis, a sound he had heard thousands of times in the high-end shops where counterfeiters tried to mask cheap metal with expensive paint.
The machine outside wasn't just a car. It was a loud, expensive lie that threatened to drag him back into the very world he had promised to leave behind for Sophie's sake. The truth remained clear and unyielding today. Every single word mattered to his quiet, broken soul. As the hydraulics of the transport trailer hissed and the silver GTO slowly descended the ramps like a descending deity, Leo didn't look at the iconic shark nose or the gleaming wire wheels. Instead, his gaze settled on the cowl just beneath the windshield, where a row of small aluminum rivets secured the bodywork to the chassis. Marcus was standing nearby, his chest puffed out like a peacock, boasting to a local city official about the car's flawless, museum-grade condition. To any other observer, the car was a vision of mechanical perfection. But to Leo, that perfection was a loud, screaming alarm. He didn't need a ruler to see that the spacing between every single rivet was exactly 12.5 millimeters, executed with a surgical, mathematical precision that only a modern CNC laser could achieve. In 1962, the Scaglietti Bodyworks in Modena was a place of noise, sweat, and human error. The artisans who hammered these bodies out of raw aluminum sheets used wooden mallets and their own eyes to judge distances, meaning every authentic GTO in existence carries a unique signature of human variance. There are slight overlaps, uneven depths, and microscopic shifts in the metal that tell the story of a man working by hand in a drafty Italian shop. This silver car had no such story. The lines were too clean, the curves too symmetrical, and the rivets were far too orderly to have ever seen the inside of a 1960s workshop. Leo realized, in a cold flash of professional certainty, that this machine hadn't been born in Italy at the hands of a master. It had been birthed in a high-end super replicator facility in the United Kingdom, where cold computers are now used to mimic the sweat of the past. Marcus was flaunting a masterpiece of forgery, oblivious to the terrifying fact that the machine was far too perfect to be real. And in the world of vintage racing, perfection is always the first sign of a dangerous lie. He knew the truth. He watched Marcus smirk. He felt a chill down his aching, tired spine. The dawn arrived with a cold, insistent wind that rattled the thin window panes of the cottage, a reminder that winter was creeping toward the valley much faster than the coins were trickling into Leo's pocket. He spent 4 hours on his knees in the freezing mud of the North Field, wrestling with the seized transmission of an ancient John Deere that had belonged to the same family since the Great Depression.
The farmer, a man whose skin looked like weathered leather and whose hands were gnarled by decades of unrewarded toil, apologized with a sincere, heavy heart because he couldn't offer a single dollar for the labor. Instead, he dropped a cord of seasoned oak firewood into the back of Leo's truck, a payment for warmth in a season that offered very little else. Leo accepted the wood with a stoic nod, knowing that while it would keep the stove burning through December, it wouldn't put shoes on Sophie's feet or food in the pantry. When he stepped back into the quiet warmth of the kitchen, he found Sophie at the small pine table,
her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to finish a drawing of a Ferrari using markers that were nearly dry and paper that was actually the back of old shop invoices. She looked up at him with Elena's hopeful, sparkling eyes, asking if they could go to the store to get the big set of colored pencils she had seen in the window. Leo looked at the empty jar on the counter where he kept the emergency cash and felt a sharp, jagged spike of shame. He needed exactly $50 for the paints and pencils Sophie deserved, a small sum that felt like an impossible mountain in the face of his current reality.
The contrast was a silent, screaming injustice that burned in the back of his throat as he thought of Marcus Sterling across the valley. Marcus was currently flaunting a $48 million forgery, a machine built of ego and deception that was worth more than 1,000 lifetimes of labor. He needed $50 for paints, while Marcus was about to lose enough to buy 10,000 art galleries. He watched his daughter try to coax color out of a dying marker, knowing that the billionaire's expensive pride was about to collide with a truth that was far more durable. Marcus Sterling was not a man who enjoyed quiet victories. Within 24 hours of arriving in town, he had organized what he called a victory auction, a high-stakes global event designed to flip his silver Ferrari for a staggering $60 million to a consortium of overseas investors. To validate the sale, Marcus didn't seek out seasoned historians or metallurgical experts. Instead, he hired a team of young, charismatic influencer experts who arrived in a whirlwind of cameras and glowing tablets. These men moved around the car with theatrical flourishes, taking high-resolution selfies and verifying the machine's history based on the glossy finish of its paint and the curated digital records Marcus had provided in a gold-embossed letter folder.
They spoke in hollow buzzwords about prestige and market value, ignoring the physical soul of the car in favor of the aesthetic appeal that would look best on a smartphone screen. Marcus sat in the back of his limousine, watching the social media engagement metrics climb, convinced that his wealth had successfully engineered a new reality. In a local newspaper interview that afternoon, he took one final public swing at Leo Thorne, laughing as he told the reporter that the small-town mechanic's doubts were merely the bitter, desperate ramblings of a man who was jealous of a world he would never inhabit. Marcus claimed that while Leo was stuck in the dusty past, he was building the high-tech future of elite high-end investing. He called Leo a relic of a dying age, a man who couldn't tell the difference between a work of art and a pile of scrap metal. The influencers continued their performance, nodding in agreement as they certified the paperwork with digital signatures, never realizing that a document is only as honest as the metal it represents. They were certifying the paperwork, but they hadn't bothered to look at the molecules of the fuel tank or the hidden casting marks that whispered a much darker truth. Marcus was basking in the glow of his great impending triumph, oblivious to the fact that his legacy was built on sand.
The garage was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the oscillating fan and the intermittent chirp of a cricket hidden beneath the workbench. Leo sat hunched over a flickering monitor, his eyes bloodshot as he sifted through a mountain of digital archives and old scanned factory manifests from the early 60s. He was hunting for the soul of chassis 3851 GT, a number that Marcus Sterling claimed was sitting in his silver trailer. Leo adjusted his glasses, focusing on the grainy images of the engine block. In his mind, the blueprint was clear. The 3.0-liter V12 should have a specific raised casting mark on the rear of the engine block, a minor structural reinforcement that only appeared on units manufactured after June of 1962. If Marcus's car was truly the world record-holding 3851 GT, it should have the earlier, smoother block casting. He remembered Elena telling him that history was written in the imperfections of the foundry, not the ink of the ledger. He navigated to a password-protected enthusiast registry based out of Osaka, a place where the world's most secretive collectors traded data like state secrets. After 2 hours of cross-referencing shipping manifests and insurance riders from a decade ago, he found it. A grainy, high-resolution photo from a climate-controlled bunker in the Shizuoka prefecture. There, under the soft yellow glow of a sodium lamp, sat the real chassis 3851 GT, its original Rosso China paint perfectly preserved,
and its history accounted for by a family that had owned it since 1994. The car across the valley, in Marcus's possession, wasn't a masterpiece. It was a ghost, a high-fidelity duplicate designed to deceive the eyes of the greedy and the uninformed. It was a mechanical phantom constructed of modern alloys and forged documents, a shadow cast by a billionaire's desperate need for validation. Leo leaned back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his weary eyes as he realized the magnitude of the fraud Marcus was about to perpetrate on the global market. He felt a cold sense of duty settle over him, the responsibility of the historian to protect the truth from the predator. The ghost was about to be exorcised by a man with a magnifying glass and a long memory, and the fallout would be absolute. He knew that by morning, Marcus would learn that shadows cannot survive the dawn. He was ready for the final confrontation. The local diner, usually a sanctuary of shared complaints about the weather and crop yields, had been transformed into a hive of frantic, wide-eyed speculation. Everywhere Leo went, the conversation followed the same intoxicating rhythm: Marcus Sterling and his silver goddess. The town council had already begun discussing a classic car weekend that would bring thousands of high-spending tourists to their dusty streets, and they viewed Marcus as the messianic figure who would finally put their fading county on the global map. At the hardware store, Bill Thompson, a man Leo had known for 20 years, stopped mid-transaction to deliver a lecture on gratitude. He told Leo that he was being a hater, a word that sounded absurd coming from a man in his 60s, and suggested that Leo should put aside his bitter professional pride and just apologize to the billionaire before he ruined their best chance at survival. The pressure was a cold, pervasive fog that seemed to seep through the very cracks of Leo's garage. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches now looked away when he drove past, as if his skepticism was a contagious disease that might infect their newfound hope. To them, Marcus was the shining future, a man of chrome and digital certainty, while Leo was just the bitter, jealous neighbor who couldn't stand to see someone else win. They didn't want to hear about aluminum density or metallurgical signatures. They wanted the $60 million dream to be real, regardless of the cost to history. Leo walked through the town feeling like a stranger in a place he had helped build, his silence interpreted as a declaration of war. He saw the Sterling legacy posters plastered on the windows of the general store and felt a hollow, sickening sense of dread for the people who were betting their livelihoods on a lie. The truth was a lonely island, and Leo Thorne was the only one standing on it as the tide came in, watching the water rise around his heavy boots while the rest of the town cheered for the storm that was coming. Leo walked with a heavy, unhurried pace through the revolving glass doors of the Grand Hotel, his presence a jagged, oil-stained contrast to the lobby's white marble and gold leaf accents. He wasn't there to beg or to vent his frustration. He was there because he owed a debt to the history Marcus Sterling was currently trying to rewrite. He found Marcus standing in a roped-off gallery, surrounded by his team of influencer experts who were currently recording a video about the investment of the century. Leo stepped past a velvet rope, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as he interrupted Marcus's mid-sentence boast. He told Marcus that he needed to look at the secondary chassis rail beneath the driver's side floor plate immediately. Leo explained that the grain of the aluminum was consistent with modern hydraulic extrusion, a process that didn't exist in the Modena workshops of the early 60s. He warned the billionaire that if the prince's inspectors found that discrepancy during the post-auction audit, it wouldn't just be a civil lawsuit, it would be a criminal charge for international art fraud. Marcus slowly turned, a look of incredulous amusement crossing his face as he adjusted his diamond-studded cufflinks. He didn't look at the technical data Leo held out. He looked at the red clay on Leo's boots and the faint smell of engine degreaser that followed him. Marcus laughed, a cold and hollow sound that drew the attention of the surrounding socialites, and called Leo a disgraced stalker who had clearly spent too much time breathing in exhaust fumes. He turned to his head of security, a man in a black tactical suit, and barked a command to remove the trash from the premises before he contaminated the air of the gallery any further. As the security guard gripped Leo's arms, Leo didn't resist. He simply looked at the billionaire with a terrifyingly calm pity, knowing that the trap was already set. Leo had offered Marcus the truth for free, as a courtesy to the machine, but now the man would have to pay for the lie with his soul and his entire reputation by morning. He walked out into the cool night air, leaving the noise of the elite behind, the silence of the valley, waiting for the inevitable storm to finally break over his arrogant head once and for all this evening, right at this moment. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of curated greed, where the air hummed with the vibration of high-frequency wealth. Elite buyers had descended from every corner of the globe, their bespoke suits reflecting the overhead spotlights like dark glass. At the center of the stage, elevated on a platform of rotating white marble, sat the silver 250 GTO. It looked like a goddess carved from light, its curves enticing the world's most powerful checkbooks to open wide. Marcus Sterling stood at the edge of the VIP lounge, a flute of vintage Krug in one hand and a diamond-encrusted watch on the other, watching the digital bidding board with the eyes of a starving predator. The numbers were climbing at a staggering pace, jumping from 40 million to 45 in the span of 30 frantic seconds. The primary antagonist of the room was a Middle Eastern prince seated in the front row, whose single nod of the head represented more money than the entire valley would see in a decade. Every time he raised his hand, the room gasped, a collective intake of breath that fueled Marcus's swelling ego. He was currently minutes away from finalizing a $60 million sale, a transaction that would yield him a clean $12 million profit on a machine he had only owned for a few months. To the crowd, this was the peak of high-end automotive investing, a moment of historic cultural exchange. To Marcus, it was the ultimate validation of his power over the truth. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of resistance, his sneer growing wider as the auctioneer's rhythmic chant reached a fever pitch. The billionaire felt invincible, convinced that his polished lie had successfully replaced the rusted reality of history. He didn't see the shadow at the back of the hall, nor did he hear the silent ticking of the clock he had ignored. The atmosphere was electric, a storm of ambition and pride that blinded everyone in the room to the catastrophic reality beneath the silver paint. The gavel was about to fall on a fraud that would destroy the entire vintage car market and erase the credibility of every expert in the building. As the auctioneer raised his wooden mallet, the future of automotive history hung by a single fraying thread. The billionaire smiled, ready for his coronation as the king of collectors. But the mallet never hit wood. Leo stood in the shadows at the very back of the grand ballroom, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his old work jacket, feeling like a ghost haunting a celebration of lies. He could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Sophie, a promise of a quiet, unremarkable life far from the jagged edges of the elite world that had taken Elena away. If he turned and walked out those heavy oak doors right now, he could return to the peace of the valley, the honest smell of oil, and the safety of anonymity. Marcus Sterling's fraud would succeed, the billionaire would get richer, and Leo would remain invisible. But then his eyes fixed on a young man in the second row, a nervous heir whose trembling hands held a paddle representing his family's multi-generational inheritance. Leo saw the innocent trust in the boy's expression, the same trust he saw in Sophie's eyes every morning, and he realized he could not let another life be built on a foundation of sand. He reached into his inner pocket and touched the small, worn photograph of Elena he carried everywhere. She had been the guardian of history, a woman who believed that the past was a sacred trust that could not be sold or distorted for the sake of profit. To stay silent was to betray everything she had lived for and everything he had taught Sophie about integrity. The room was a whirlwind of light and noise, a loud, artificial theater of greed that demanded his complicity. He looked at the silver car on the stage, a machine that had once represented the pinnacle of human endeavor, now reduced to a tool for a billionaire's ego. He knew that speaking up would shatter his quiet world and bring the cameras back to his doorstep, but some things were more valuable than safety. Silence was safe, but the truth was a debt Leo owed to the metal he loved. He took one final breath, squared his heavy shoulders, and walked toward the stage as the mallet rose. Leo stepped out of the shadows and began walking down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, his heavy work boots striking the marble with a deliberate, rhythmic finality that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The auctioneer froze with his mallet suspended in midair, and the Middle Eastern prince lowered his paddle as all eyes turned toward the man in the faded navy coveralls. Two massive security guards moved to intercept him, their hands reaching for his shoulders. But Leo didn't slow his pace. He moved with the unyielding momentum of a physical law. From his perch in the VIP lounge, Marcus Sterling let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the gilded ceiling, shouting for the crowd to look, because the local mechanic had finally decided he wanted a better view of a world he would never understand. Marcus's voice was high and jagged, with a false confidence that didn't reach his eyes. Leo ignored the insults and the reaching hands, stepping onto the rotating marble platform and standing directly beside the silver goddess. He didn't look at the crowd or the billionaire. He only looked at the metal. He reached into the pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a small amber glass vial and a surgical chemical swab. Before the guards could pull him back, Leo bent down and applied the swab to a small, unpainted section of the inner chassis rail near the steering box, a place where the silver finish had been intentionally left thin to mimic factory aging. The room went deathly silent as a faint, sharp chemical odor drifted into the air. Within 5 seconds, the area where the liquid touched the steel didn't remain clear. It bloomed into a brilliant, unmistakable shade of electric cobalt blue. Leo stood up slowly, holding the vial toward the lights, his voice calm and terrifyingly precise as he addressed the stunned silence of the room. He explained that this wasn't an opinion, but a chemical reaction to the molecular structure of the metal itself. Leo stood on the rotating marble stage, the electric blue chemical stain on the chassis rail serving as a silent indictment against the silver machine. He turned his gaze toward the billionaire, whose face had shifted from triumphant purple to a sickly ashen gray. Leo's voice was devoid of malice, carrying only the clinical weight of an expert witness as he addressed the room of stunned millionaires. He explained that the original Scaglietti factory in Modena utilized hand-hammered 1.2mm aluminum alloy enriched with specific trace amounts of magnesium to save weight for the 1962 racing season. He then gestured to a microscopic digital caliper he had produced from his pocket, revealing that this bodywork was made of a uniform 1.0mm modern aerospace alloy that had been cold-rolled by a machine, not forged by a man. The contrast between the billionaire's expensive arrogance and Leo's quiet authority was now absolute. Leo reached into the footwell, peeling back a layer of carefully aged leather to reveal the chassis stamping. With the cold precision of a surgeon, he pointed out the ghost of a hidden, modern 17-digit vehicle identification number that had been crudely flattened and re-stamped with the historic 5-digit Ferrari racing code. It was a masterpiece of deception, but it was still a lie. The auctioneer's mallet felt heavy in the silence as the billionaire's $48 million pride was debunked by a 5-cent chemical reaction. Just as Marcus began to scream for security to remove the intruder, a silver-haired man in the third row, wearing a pin from the Ferrari Classic apartment in Morinello, stood up with a look of profound disbelief. He stepped toward the stage, his voice trembling as he called out into the quiet hall. He asked if it was truly him, referring to Leo as Master Thorne, the man who had vanished after the legendary Rosso Corsa authentication in 2018.